They said I'd die poor and alone, like some prediction carved into my skin, a cruel sentence disguised as family wisdom, whispered by my own daughter when she thought I was too tired to argue back, a phrase she sharpened on her tongue each time I asked for company or offered advice, the same words she repeated to her children so often that I once heard my grandson, only 12, mimic it with careless precision. Grandma will die poor and alone. And he said it while laughing, not knowing how. His laughter cracked open the walls inside me, not knowing how words travel further than fists and bruise deeper than hands. I remember that moment with painful clarity because it was the first time I saw my invisibility reflected in a child's eyes. The first time I realized that the younger generation already learned to place me in a corner like an old umbrella. Kept around for utility, but never admired, never wanted, never even noticed until rain fell. I am 78 now, though some mornings my bones argue for 85, and some evenings my spirit refuses to admit I'm older than 50. I live in a quiet apartment with a man who wears pressed shirts even on Sundays and still believes in polishing his shoes before he takes out the trash. A man who neighbors whisper about because he was once the wealthiest widower in the building and who still carries himself with a mixture of dignity and fatigue, as though the years have cost him everything except his posture. They don't whisper as much about me, not yet, because they don't know what to make of this arrangement, this odd companionship that blossomed between two people who were supposed to finish their days on parallel tracks of loneliness, never intersecting, never touching, never admitting that sometimes life delivers second chances in the least poetic of places. I sit here now on his balcony, overlooking a courtyard lined with tired hedges and uneven bricks, and I think about those words again. You'll die poor and alone, and how wrong and right they were at the same time. I did not die, not yet, though I have rehearsed it in my mind enough times to know what silence feels like. I am not poor, not anymore. Though money was never truly the absence I feared, it was dignity. It was the look on the landlord's face when I handed over rent late. It was the way the grocery clerk checked if my card would decline when I bought. Nothing more than bread, tea, and the cheapest vegetables. And I am certainly not alone, though the company I have now is not the kind my family ever imagined for me, because to them companionship meant burden, responsibility, caretaking, another mouth to feed, another set of shoes by the door that did not fit into their curated lives. I have lived enough years to know that the first words someone uses to describe you are often the last ones they truly believe, and mine were always tied to scarcity and shame. Poor, alone, needy, fragile, a drain. I wore those labels like secondhand coats, stiff on the shoulders, wrong in the sleeves, but heavy all the same. I tried to shake them off, tried to prove that I could still manage, still work, still stretch a pension into a meal that resembled comfort. But nothing I did ever softened the judgment in their eyes. My daughter, elegant and exhausted from the life she chose, once told me over coffee that she dreaded becoming me. I asked her what she meant, and she gestured vaguely at my cardigan, my thinning hair, my unpaid medical bills folded neatly in a drawer. This, she said, this endless scraping together, this constant asking. I wanted to remind her that I had asked very little, that most of what I gave had been stolen with politeness. babysitting, birthday checks, casseroles delivered in Tupperware that never returned, holiday gifts purchased from money I could not spare, silence about insults I did not deserve. But she wasn't listening then. She rarely was. And in truth, I stopped offering explanations because explanations never softened cruelty. They only prolonged the moment of dismissal. So when she finally said it plain, "You'll die poor and alone," I let the words sit between us like a third person at the table, invisible but loud. And I did not contradict her because I had grown tired of correcting people's expectations. Instead, I went home, stirred the soup on my stove, and stared at the slow swirl of carrots and onions as if they could tell me whether prophecy was the same as truth. It is strange, looking back, to realize that insult became seed because what was meant to bury me eventually sprouted into something unexpected, a new kind of hunger, a refusal to accept their vision of my ending. I could not rewrite my past. I had been a nurse, a mother, a wife whose husband left too early, a woman who stretched her back across double shifts until it cracked, who gave without tallying the return. But I could, perhaps, alter the final chapters. Even if it meant doing something reckless for my age. At the time, though, I did not know what recklessness would look like. I only knew that loneliness was not a season to be endured, but a disease that chewed at the edges of the mind. That poverty was not just about bank accounts, but about how people spoke to you as if you had lost the right to expect anything. I learned to live in that liminal state, half invisible, half resented, until chance, or perhaps stubbornness disguised as chance, placed me at a doorway I never thought I would enter. But that comes later. For now, what you need to know is simple. I was told I would die poor and alone, and I believed it long enough to start preparing. I packed away dreams like winter clothes, folding them neatly into drawers I rarely opened. I taught myself to shrink at family gatherings, to smile when ignored, to pretend I enjoyed silence when really it pressed on me like a heavy quilt. I even rehearsed goodbyes in my head, whispering them to no one in particular, just to hear how they might sound when the time came. What they didn't expect, what I didn't expect either, was that survival has its own stubborn rhythm. It does not care about predictions or insults or the categories children place their mothers into. It lingers, it waits, it looks for openings, and when one appears, even in the most unlikely form, a stranger's knock, a neighbor's cat, a balcony with peeling paint, it pushes you forward. That is where I begin, not in the certainty of their insult, but in the quiet rebellion of still being here, still breathing, still capable of saying, "No, I did not die poor. I did not die alone. And the story you wrote for me is not the one I am." Telling ya, it happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day when nothing announces itself as pivotal until much later. When the dust has settled and memory begins to underline details you almost ignored at the time. But I can tell you now that the words which finally broke me did not arrive like thunder. They arrived like a whisper that had been waiting for years to harden into cruelty. And the moment they were spoken, I felt the air leave the room as if my daughter had opened a window and invited the cold in. I had fallen the week before, not badly, just a slip on the front steps while carrying groceries. And though the bruises were nothing dramatic, my hip ached more than I wanted to admit. So when she came by to check on me, or rather when she came by, because the neighbor had called her to say she saw me limping, I thought perhaps there might be some tenderness between us again, a moment of recognition that I was still her mother. still the woman who once carried her fevered body through nights of illness, who saved every extra dollar to buy her first piano lessons, who shielded her from storms of disappointment that she cannot even remember. Instead, she looked around my small apartment with narrowed eyes, her lips pressed thin, and when I suggested timidly that perhaps I might move in with them for a short while until the pain eased, she set her coffee cup down with a deliberate clink and said she was sorry, but it simply wasn't possible, that their house was already too crowded, too complicated, too busy. And then, as if that were not enough, she added the sentence that sliced through everything. "You've had your time, Mom. Don't guilt us into giving up ours." I sat very still because I have learned that moving too quickly when someone is insulting you only confirms their suspicion that you are unstable. But inside, I could feel something collapsing, a quiet crumbling of the small dignity I had left. And when she left shortly after, brushing my cheek with a kiss that felt more like a duty than affection, I realized that what she had really told me was not about square footage or convenience, but about the fact that my existence had become a nuisance, that my presence in her home would mark her life as lesser, weighed down by an old woman with nothing to offer but needs. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table, staring at the unopened envelopes of bills, listening to the radiator hiss like a tired animal. And for the first time, I considered the possibility that perhaps they were right. Perhaps I was destined to fade quietly in this cramped room, surviving but never belonging, waiting for some merciful end that would relieve them of obligation. But the body has a way of resisting despair, and so does memory. And as I sat there, I thought of all the years I had given without ledger, of the endless hours at the clinic where I worked double shifts to pay for college tuition, of the sacrifices that left me with little savings but gave them futures, and something inside me burned against the injustice of being told that all of that equaled nothing more than an inconvenient old age. The next day, I received another reminder of how invisible I had become when I called the landlord about the water stain spreading across the ceiling, and he sighed as though I were a child interrupting his important work and said, I should be grateful. The building was still habitable, as if shelter itself were a favor bestowed upon me, and not something I had earned with every check I scraped together. It was then, in the echo of his indifference layered upon my daughter's dismissal, that I realized the prophecy of dying poor and alone was not a prediction at all, but a plan, a story others had already written for me and were content to watch unfold. I wish I could tell you that I reacted with immediate strength, that I slammed the phone down and declared I would no longer live according to their script. But the truth is more ordinary and more painful. I sat on the edge of my bed with my face in my hands, whispering aloud to no one, I don't want to disappear. And the sound of my own voice frightened me because it carried the desperation of a child lost in a store, calling out for someone who may not come. That was the moment, though, the quiet crack that let in the possibility of something else, because once you admit you don't want to disappear, you have already declared that you must try to be seen. 2 days later, when the pipe finally burst and sent a thin stream of water down the wall, I stood in the middle of the room holding a saucepan to catch the drip. And instead of calling the landlord again, I laughed, an odd, startled laugh that sounded almost hysterical, because suddenly I understood that no one was coming to fix any of it. not the wall, not my loneliness, not my shrinking life. And if anything was going to change, it had to be by my own hand. Later that evening, as I sat wrapped in a sweater that smelled faintly of mothballs, my daughter called, not to ask how I was, but to inquire if I was still receiving the pension payments because she and her husband were struggling with tuition for the children. And though she framed it as concern, I could hear the calculation in her tone, the subtle fishing for whether I might be able to contribute. And when I said carefully that my own expenses were heavy, she sighed in a way that carried judgment rather than sympathy and ended the call quickly. I looked around my apartment then, at the peeling linoleum, the sagging bookshelf, the single photograph of myself from decades ago, when I still wore my nurse's uniform and believed that hard work would guarantee respect in old age. And I knew, could not wait here for someone else to reimagine me. That night, I opened the drawer where I kept old letters and bills, and tucked inside was an envelope with an address written in my late husband's handwriting. An address from a time when life was still filled with beginnings instead of endings. And I thought, perhaps, it is not too late to begin again. Perhaps the cruelty of my daughter's words was not the closing of a door, but the slamming that wakes you from sleep. I pressed the paper flat against the table, smoothed it with my palms, and though my hands trembled slightly, I felt a steadiness rising beneath the tremor, the certainty that this moment of rejection was not the death they predicted, but the catalyst I never expected. When I look back on that first week after the conversation with my daughter and the burst pipe in the wall, I realize how subtle the descent was, how the worsening of my situation came not through grand events or violent ruptures, but through a series of small indignities and quiet erasures, each one insignificant on its own, yet together forming a slow suffocation. And I remember thinking that this must be how people disappear, not in sudden catastrophe, but in the steady erosion of being seen, until one day you realize you have become the ghost of your own life. I woke each morning to the same stained ceiling and the smell of damp plaster. And though I tried to tell myself that I was fine, that others had endured worse, I could feel the walls themselves pressing closer, as though the apartment resented my presence and wished to expel me. The landlord stopped answering my calls, and when I left messages, he responded only once with a curt text, reminding me that my lease was nearly up and that he had a waiting list of tenants ready to pay more, as if to remind me that even the roof over my head was provisional, a temporary favor extended to someone of no value. I still forced myself out each morning, clutching my canvas bag as if the ritual of buying bread and milk might tether me to the world. But even in the small errands, I began to feel the shift. The cashier who used to greet me with a smile now rushed me through with the impatience reserved for the elderly, the ones who count change too slowly and hold up the line, though I did neither. At the post office, a clerk spoke loudly into my face as if I had lost my hearing, though I had only asked a simple question about stamps. On the bus, younger passengers no longer offered their seats, pretending instead to be lost in their phones. And I told myself I did not need their pity. But what I longed for was not the seat itself. It was the recognition that I still existed as part of their world. I noticed also that my phone remained silent for days. No calls, no messages. And when I picked it up to make one myself, to reach out to an old friend from church or a distant cousin, I put it down again, ashamed of how transparent my need might sound, because I knew most people answered such calls with polite dread, already searching for excuses to end the conversation. The loneliness became physical then, settling into my body like a second skeleton. I began eating less, not because I wanted to, but because food without company tasted like ash. My reflection in the bathroom mirror grew sharper, my cheeks hollower, and I found myself avoiding my own gaze, as though even I no longer wished to witness the slow decline. At night, I lay awake, listening to the apartment breathe around me, the radiator sighing, the pipes clanging. And I wondered if perhaps my daughter was right, if perhaps my time had ended, and I was only clinging to scraps that did not belong to me. Anymore. The thought frightened me, yet I could not silence it, and so I filled the hours with small distractions, sorting old photographs into boxes, rereading novels I no longer had the patience for, staring at the television without absorbing a word. Each activity was less about pleasure than about proving that I could still move through the motions of living. And yet, even as the world seemed to close its doors, I noticed how memory began to stir. I would be stirring soup and suddenly recall the kitchen of my youth, the laughter of my husband before his illness, the clatter of my children's voices, and I would feel for a brief instant that I was still anchored to something larger. But then the memory would fade, and the silence would return heavier than before. One afternoon, as I carried a bag of laundry down the street to the self-service, a neighbor stopped me, not to offer help, but to remark on how brave I was to be managing alone at my age. Her words were framed as praise, yet beneath them was the suggestion that solitude had become my identity, that to need no one was the only virtue left to me, and I realized with a kind of bitterness that even kindness now felt like dismissal. It was around this time that the fear began to change its shape. In the beginning, I had feared poverty, the slow dwindling of resources, the humiliation of not being able to pay for medicine or rent. But now I saw that poverty was only half the threat. The greater danger was erasure, the way society itself seemed designed to step around me, to speak over me, to plan as though I had already vanished. I remembered how my grandson had once repeated those words, "Grandma will die poor and alone." And I understood now that it had not been a child's careless cruelty, but an echo of what he heard from the adults around him. And the realization cut deeper than I expected. Because what is the future if even your own blood is taught to forget you? So the days stretched into each other, each one quieter, thinner, more fragile. I tried to distract myself with walks through the neighborhood, but even those grew heavy with reminders. Couples passed me without a glance. Young mothers pulled their children closer as if old age were contagious, and I saw reflections of myself in shop windows, a solitary figure moving slowly through streets designed for speed. At times I would stop at the bakery, not because I wanted bread, but because the young woman behind the counter was one of the few who still asked me a genuine question, where I lived, how I liked the neighborhood, and I clung to her words like a drowning person clings to driftwood. But once I stepped back into the street, the silence swallowed me again. At home, the leaking pipe worsened, the plaster swelling, until one night it split open and dripped steadily into a bucket I had placed beneath it. The sound was maddening, a constant reminder of neglect, and though I could have demanded repair, I no longer believed anyone would listen. Instead, I began to imagine the bucket filling endlessly, the water spilling across the floor, rising slowly until it covered the bed, until it drowned me quietly in my sleep. And the thought both frightened and comforted me. because at least then I would be noticed. At least then the world would have to acknowledge my absence. It was in these quiet torments that I began to sense that something had to give, that I could not continue in this suspended state of half-life. And though I had no clear plan, the pressure built silently, pushing me toward a decision I did not yet know I was preparing to make. And that was how the first escalation came to me, not as drama or confrontation, but as a gradual narrowing of my world until the only choice left was to break through the walls or suffocate inside them. The shift began in the smallest and most unremarkable way, not with a grand revelation or a miracle, but with an invitation that wasn't even meant for me. A flyer slipped under the wrong door in the apartment building, advertising a community potluck in the lounge of the neighboring complex. And though my first instinct was to throw it away, since I had grown used to believing such gatherings were not meant for people like me anymore, something in me hesitated, perhaps because the evening promised food, and I was tired of eating soup alone, or perhaps because the silence in my apartment had grown so dense that I needed even the faintest excuse to step into a room filled with voices. And so I folded the paper into my coat pocket and told myself that I would only go to sit quietly in a corner and leave before anyone noticed. When the evening arrived, I almost lost my nerve, standing in front of the mirror adjusting the collar of my navy dress, the one I saved for funerals and occasional visits to the doctor. And I thought how pitiful it must look that I was preparing myself as if this were an event of importance, when really it was just an accident of mistaken delivery. But something in the reflection pushed me forward anyway, perhaps defiance, perhaps desperation. And so I went. The lounge was already buzzing when I arrived, the tables covered in mismatched dishes, the air heavy with the smell of casseroles, roasted chicken, and pies that reminded me of holidays long gone. And I felt immediately the awkwardness of arriving, alone, of not having a tray or a family to anchor me. But I forced myself to step inside and stand near the wall, pretending I was waiting for someone. That was when I noticed him, sitting slightly apart at a table with an untouched plate of food, a man in his 80s with neatly combed silver hair, a crisp shirt buttoned to the collar, and an expression that seemed both guarded and weary, as though he had been dragged there against his will. Our eyes met briefly, and I looked away. But when I finally did approach the table to rest my plate, he made a wry remark about the meatloaf being dry enough to use as insulation. And though the joke was simple, it startled a laugh out of me, a sound I had not heard in my own throat for weeks, and that laugh became the first thread between us. His name was Walter, and though he spoke sparingly at first, I could sense the shape of his solitude beneath every word, a solitude that mirrored my own. Over the next weeks, our paths crossed again, not by design, but by the slow rhythm of routine. For he lived in the building next door and often sat on the benches in the courtyard, reading newspapers that seemed older than the day itself. And I, restless from the drip of the leaking pipe, began to take longer walks outside simply to escape my apartment's suffocation. The conversation started small, about the weather, the rising cost of bread, the poor state of the benches, but soon grew into longer exchanges. And one evening, when a stray cat darted across the pavement and nearly knocked his cane from his hand, I picked it up for him, and he said with a seriousness that surprised me, "Would you stay for tea if I asked properly?" And though the invitation sounded old-fashioned, almost theatrical, I heard in it a sincerity that melted my hesitation, and I said, yes. That first cup of tea was the turning point, though I did not realize it then. His apartment was larger than mine, tidier, filled with books and framed photographs of a life that seemed almost intimidating in its order. Yet the air carried the unmistakable scent of loneliness, that sharp mix of polish and emptiness. And as we sat across from each other at his oak table sipping tea from china cups, I felt the strangest sensation of being both out of place and completely at ease. He told me about his late wife, how she had loved roses but hated the thorns, how she had left behind recipes he never dared to attempt because cooking had been her domain. And in his words, I sensed not only grief, but also the longing to share memory with someone who would not rush him. I told him about my years in the clinic, about the exhaustion of double shifts and the small pride I took in knowing that patients trusted me, and he listened with a kind of attentiveness that I had forgotten was possible. In the days that followed, I found myself anticipating our encounters. I still lived in the same damp apartment with the swollen ceiling and the hostile landlord, still ate simple meals, still faced the indifference of the world. But the knowledge that I might share an hour of conversation with someone who saw me not as a burden but as a person altered the texture of my days. I began to take more care with my appearance, brushing my hair more carefully, polishing my shoes, even wearing the scarf I had left in a drawer for years, not because I wanted to impress him, but because I wanted to feel visible again. For the first time in months, I looked forward to something, however small, and in that anticipation I recognized the faint stirrings of agency, the reminder that I had not been erased entirely. It would be false to say that I fell into joy quickly. Doubt clung to me, whispering that I was foolish, that he was only humoring me, that sooner or later the conversations would stop and I would be left more bereft than before. But each time I prepared for withdrawal, Walter surprised me with a gentleness that disarmed my fear. He never patronized me, never hurried me, never suggested that I was less for my age or my circumstances. Instead, he asked questions with genuine curiosity about books I liked, about places I had once traveled, about my opinion on the latest news. And though these were ordinary subjects, they were extraordinary to me because they acknowledged that I still had thoughts worth hearing. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the balance of my life shifted. The drip of water in the ceiling became background noise, the silence of my phone less suffocating, the ache in my hip less consuming, because something inside me had tilted from despair toward possibility. It was not romance then, not yet, not even close. It was recognition, a kind of mirror held up to my loneliness, showing me that I was not the only one abandoned by the rhythm of younger lives, not the only one cast aside by a family too busy to remember. In Walter's presence, I found proof that survival after rejection was possible, that companionship did not require youth or beauty, only the courage to sit across a table and speak honestly. And as the weeks turned into months, I realized with a clarity that startled me that my daughter's prediction was already unraveling, because though I still had little money, and though my future remained uncertain, I was no longer entirely alone, and that simple truth felt like rebellion. The midpoint of my story, if I must name it, was not when Walter eventually asked me to move into his apartment, not when I discovered the scale of his wealth, not when my family tried to intrude again, but this quieter moment. the first time I chose. Not to wait for someone else's call, but instead walked next door of my own accord, knocked on his door, and asked if he would like company. The look on his face, the mix of surprise and relief, told me everything. I was not invisible. I was still capable of altering the course of my own days. And for the first time in years, I no longer believed that dying poor and alone was inevitable. The peace of those first months with Walter was fragile, like porcelain carried carefully across a room where any stumble could shatter it. And though I cherished each moment of companionship, each cup of tea, each slow walk through the courtyard, where we complained about the state of the hedges or the noise of the children from the next building, I always knew that life has a way of testing whatever small happiness it allows you, as if to see whether you are strong enough to keep it. And, soon enough, the test arrived. Not through Walter himself, but through the reappearance of the very voices I had thought I had escaped. The family who had cast me off, only to remember me when they sensed I might no longer be dependent. It began with a letter, a real one, not an email or a text, the kind of letter that arrives heavy in the hand, with my daughter's neat, slanted handwriting across the envelope. For a long time I did not open it, leaving it on the table like a dormant insect, afraid of what might emerge if I disturbed it, because I knew that whatever words lay inside would be written not for my comfort, but for her convenience. When at last I slid it open with a kitchen knife, the contents were exactly as I feared. Not a note of love or concern, but a performance of worry laced with accusation, telling me she and her husband were anxious because I had withdrawn from the family, that the grandchildren missed me, that they wanted to know I was safe, as if safety were the thing they had ever cared about, as if they had not been the very people to remind me again and again that I was unwelcome in their ordered lives. I folded the letter carefully and tucked it into a drawer, not because I valued it, but because I wanted evidence, proof for myself that I was not imagining the tone, that even when they reached out, it was not about me, but about the discomfort my absence caused them. Walter noticed my silence that evening as we sat in his living room, and though he did not pry, he asked softly if I was all right. I nearly told him the truth, nearly unburdened the years of rejection and dismissal. But old habits die hard, and I have spent a lifetime concealing pain so that others will not call me dramatic. So instead, I smiled and said I was fine. He did not believe me, of course, but he respected my refusal, which in itself was a gift. The second blow came not long after, when I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize, and against my better judgment, I answered, only to hear the voice of my grandson, the eldest, the one who once repeated the cruel prophecy of my lonely death with careless laughter, now grown enough to sound like a man, but still carrying the tone of a boy who had not yet decided what kind of man he wished to become. He said he missed me, that his parents were worried, that they thought I might have fallen ill, and though part of me softened at the sound of his voice, another part bristled at the familiarity, the way he spoke as though nothing had happened, as though I had not been left to rot in silence until curiosity or gossip pulled me back into their awareness. I answered gently but firmly, telling him that I was fine, that I was busy, that he should focus on his studies, and I could hear the confusion in his silence, as if he had expected the old grandmother, eager for crumbs of attention, to leap at the chance for contact. It was after these intrusions that the whispers began in the building, Neighbors commenting that they had seen me often with Walter, that I seemed to be spending nights at his apartment, that perhaps I was taking advantage of him. The cruelty of such assumptions cut me deeply because it reduced what we shared to a transaction, as though an old woman could not possibly be valued for her presence alone, only for her supposed ambition to secure wealth. One afternoon, I overheard two women in the lobby speaking in lowered tones, one saying, "Well, she was always a bit desperate, living in that shabby apartment," and the other replying, "It's a shame, really. But these things happen when men get lonely." And I stood there frozen, groceries clutched to my chest, invisible and yet dissected in plain view. I returned to Walter that evening shaken, ready to withdraw, to retreat into solitude again, rather than endure the humiliation of being misjudged. But when he saw my face and asked what was wrong, I told him everything. The gossip, the letter, the phone call, the feeling that I was once again being cornered into the role of burden or manipulator. He listened silently, then said in his quiet way, "They will say what they want to justify their own choices, but I know who you are, and I am old enough to know that knowing is enough." His words steadied me, though the ache remained. The escalation continued when my daughter herself appeared one Saturday afternoon, unannounced, standing stiffly in the lobby in her tailored coat, her hair perfectly arranged, her lips drawn in a smile that carried more tension than warmth. She claimed she had been nearby and thought to stop in, but I knew better. She had come to see for herself, to measure the truth of the rumors. We went upstairs to my apartment, and she looked around with the air of a realtor appraising a property, noting the damp ceiling, the sagging furniture, the faint smell of mildew, and at last she sighed and said, "You can't live like this, Mom. It's not safe." I almost laughed at the sudden transformation. The same woman who told me not to guilt her into giving up her time now playing the concerned daughter. But I bit the inside of my cheek and let her speak. She suggested that perhaps I might consider moving into an assisted living facility, somewhere where I would be cared for properly. And when I asked whether she intended to help with the cost, she faltered, then said, "We'll see what we can do," which meant, of course, nothing at all. I wanted to throw her words back at her, to remind her of every dismissal, every insult, every time she turned her back when I needed her. But instead, I simply said, "I am already cared for." And when she asked what I meant, I told her plainly, "Walter looks after me." And the flicker in her eyes revealed everything. The sudden calculation, the understanding that I was no longer dependent, no longer dangling on the threads of her reluctant generosity. She tried to mask it with another smile, but I saw the fear behind it. Not fear for me, but fear of losing control. She left soon after, promising to call, and as the door closed behind her, I felt both shaken and liberated. Because for the first time in years it was she who felt uncertain, she who could not predict my next move. The final blow of that escalation came not from her, but from Walter himself, though not in cruelty, in vulnerability. He confessed one evening, after a long silence, that he had been forgetting things lately, small details, the names of streets, the placement of his glasses, the dates of appointments, and he feared it was the beginning of decline. I looked at him then, this man who had become my companion, my unexpected salvation, and I realized with both dread and clarity that our union would not be a fairy tale escape into endless comfort. If I chose to remain, If I chose to stand beside him, it would mean facing illness, perhaps dementia, perhaps the slow unspooling of his identity, and it would mean that I would once again become a caretaker, a role I had sworn I would never return to. After years of serving everyone else, I went home that night restless, pacing the floor, torn between fear and loyalty. The gossip, the letters, the unexpected visit, all of it pressed on me like weights. And yet beneath the fear was something else, a recognition that the test was not about whether the world would accept my new life, but whether I would. In the end, I chose, not loudly, not with declarations, but with the simple act of returning to his door the next morning, carrying a basket of fruit and a loaf of bread I had baked myself. When he opened the door and saw me, his face lit with such unguarded relief that I knew then the decision was made. I would not abandon him, not for the whispers of neighbors, not for the manipulations of my daughter, not even for the looming shadow of illness. That was the second escalation. The moment when the past came clawing back with accusations, when the world tested whether I would retreat into the script they had written for me, or whether I would continue forward into an unwritten story of my own. Choosing. I chose forward, trembling but firm, because to go back would have been the true death, the one my daughter predicted. And I am not dead yet. The climax did not arrive with trumpets or applause. It arrived with the sound of paper against wood, the heavy thud of a folder placed on Walter's dining table, a gesture that carried more finality than any ring or bouquet. And as he slid it toward me with those steady hands that sometimes trembled when he reached for a teacup, I understood that this was not only a proposal of companionship, but a declaration of trust. Because inside that folder were documents transferring joint ownership of the apartment, adding my name to his accounts, and granting me medical authority should his mind falter. And though my first instinct was to recoil, to insist that I could not, that I should not, that people would talk and family would rage, I felt a deeper truth rising, that for once someone was not asking me to shrink, but to step forward, not to vanish, but to remain. He looked at me then, not with the hunger of a man clinging to youth, not with the suspicion of someone guarding his fortune, but with the calm insistence of a person who had decided that his final years would not be dictated by fear. And he said, I have had money all my life. I have had rooms filled with polished wood and neighbors who whispered my name with envy. But none of it has been worth as much as having someone who sits with me through a meal without looking at the clock I stared at. The papers, my throat tight, because I knew the moment I signed them, something would end, and something else would begin, and endings, even necessary ones, carry grief. I thought of my daughter, how she would react when she discovered that I was no longer hers to dismiss, how her fury would dress itself as concern, how she might even send lawyers to my door, and for a flicker of a second I feared it. But then I remembered her words. You've had your time. Don't guilt us into giving up ours. And I realized that she had already cast me out. She had already chosen absence over presence, and therefore she had forfeited the right to decide where I belonged. My hand shook as I reached for the pen, but I pressed it steady against the paper and signed. Each curve of my name a rebellion, each stroke of ink a refusal to be erased. And when it was done, I felt not fear, but relief, as though a weight I had carried for decades had finally shifted from my shoulders to the ground. Afterward, Walter poured 2 glasses of wine, nothing extravagant, just a dry red he said his wife used to love, and we toasted quietly, not to wealth or ownership, but to visibility, to the fact that both of us, after years of being diminished in different ways, had chosen to see and be seen. That night, I moved my few belongings into his apartment, not in boxes, just in careful armfuls. The books, the photographs, the shawl I wrapped around myself when the ceiling leaked. And as I laid them gently in new corners, I realized that I was building not a borrowed space, but a home, one that carried my fingerprints alongside his. Of course, the world did not pause to congratulate us. Within a week, I received another letter, this time not from my daughter, but from a lawyer who claimed to represent her and her husband, politely requesting confirmation of my mental state and offering to discuss long-term care solutions. I laughed when I read it, a laugh sharp enough to startle even myself, because once again, they had underestimated me. Once again, they assumed I was too frail to defend myself. And so, I sat down at Walter's desk, drew a fresh sheet of paper, and wrote my own letter in a hand that did not tremble, addressed not to them, but to their representative. I am of sound mind, in a safe environment, and acting under no duress. Any further attempts to question my choices will be considered harassment. I signed it with the same firmness with which I had signed Walter's documents, and when I mailed it at the post office, I felt taller, as if each step was reclaiming territory I had ceded long ago. The neighbors continued their whispers, of course, but they grew quieter once they realized I did not bend, and one evening, when I overheard a pair of them remark that I had landed well for myself, I turned to them, met their eyes, and said calmly, "I did not land, I walked," and they had no reply. Walter chuckled when I told him later, and said I had more courage than most generals. In truth, it was not courage, but necessity, because I knew that if I faltered even once, the narrative would swallow me whole again, and so I held my head high even when my heart quaked. It was not only the outside world I had to confront, but myself. There were nights when Walter forgot the day of the week, when he repeated questions he had asked only minutes earlier, and in those moments, the old fear returned. The dread that I had bound myself once again to caretaking, to endless self-erasure. But then he would look at me with that steady gaze and say, "You don't have to stay if it becomes too much." And the choice, the fact that it was a choice, made all the difference. I stayed because I wanted to, not because I was trapped, and that distinction drew a line of fire between the old life and the new. The climax, then, was not a single moment, but a series of decisions that formed a wall against the past. Signing the papers, writing the letter, answering the whispers, moving my belongings, choosing again each morning to sit with Walter at the table, to share tea and bread and conversation, to plant tulip bulbs on the balcony, knowing that even if neither of us lived to see them bloom, the act itself was defiance, proof that life was still unfolding. Each act was irreversible, not because I could not physically retreat, but because emotionally I had crossed a threshold, and once crossed, there was no return. When I lay down at night in that apartment, hearing the hum of Walter's breathing in the next room, I knew that I had done something my daughter never expected, something she might never forgive. I had refused the ending she wrote for me. I had written my own, and though the future still held uncertainty, though illness might come, though loss would surely return, I had already won, because I was no longer waiting to die, poor and alone. I was living, stubbornly, visibly, irreversibly, in the company of someone who chose me and whom I chose in return. Peace, when it finally came, did not arrive like a wave washing everything clean. It came like the slow settling of dust in a sunlit room, barely noticeable from one moment to the next, but undeniable when you pause and realize the air has grown. Still, and that is how I live now, in a calm that feels earned rather than granted, in a quiet that no longer suffocates me, but surrounds me with a softness I once thought was reserved only for others. Each morning, I rise before Walter, boiling water for tea, arranging the small balcony so that when he steps outside with his newspaper, the tulips we planted greet him with their stubborn colors, and I find myself watching the sky in ways I never used. 2. Searching for signs of change in the shifting light. And though my body aches and my breath sometimes shortens, I no longer mistake those signs for endings, but for the natural rhythm of a life still unfolding. I think often of the words that once haunted me, the prophecy of dying poor and alone, and how strange it is that they became a kind of fuel, not because I wished to prove anyone wrong in a childish sense, but because they revealed the cruelty of how easily the old are discarded, and I realized that I could not stop the world from discarding me, but I could refuse to discard myself. The choice to sign my name on those papers, to move my things into Walter's home, to speak back when my daughter's accusations arrived like arrows. Each of those moments became a seed, and now I walk among their blossoms every day. There are still challenges, of course. Walter's memory slips more often now, and some days he forgets what month it is, or repeats stories about his late wife as if she were still alive. And when that happens, I feel a pang of grief not only for him, but for the inevitability of time. Yet, I also feel a strength that surprises me, because I know that my presence matters, that sitting with him as he forgets is not erasure, but an act of anchoring, and that perhaps this is what companionship really means, not the preservation of youth or the denial of decline, but the decision to face the decline together, hand in hand. As for my daughter, she calls less often now, and when she does, her voice carries the brittleness of someone who knows she has lost the narrative. And though part of me still aches for reconciliation, I have stopped waiting for it, because waiting was a kind of hunger that left me empty, and I no longer need her validation to believe I am alive. Instead, I wrote a letter, not to her, but to her daughter, my granddaughter, a girl with bright eyes and restless energy. And in that letter, I did not write of anger, but of hope, telling her that when she is my age, I hope she never lets anyone convince her that her life is already behind her, that she will remember that beginnings come even when the world insists on endings, that she will plant her own tulips without asking permission. Sometimes in the evenings I sit on the balcony with Walter as the light fades and he dozes in his chair, and I look at the courtyard below where the children play, and I think about the girl I once was, the young nurse who believed that sacrifice would be repaid with loyalty, the middle-aged woman who believed that invisibility was inevitable, the old woman who feared she would vanish without anyone noticing, and I realize that all of them still live in me, braided together. But now they rest. In a body that no longer apologizes for existing, I have discovered that dignity is not something others grant you. It is something you claim by refusing to step aside. So this is my ending, or perhaps not an ending, but a continuation, quieter than before, steadier, marked not by grandeur, but by the simple truth that I am not alone, not discarded, not erased. I am here. I am seen. I am loved. And when the time finally comes, whenever it does, I will not meet it as the woman they predicted, poor and forgotten, but as the woman I became, stubborn and visible, still alive in the heart of my own story.